welcome to the latest episode of Stroma Insights. I'm joined by two colleagues today, Rob Waiting, who has been on one of these before, and a new participant in this process, a colleague from Building Control, Steve Barnshaw. Gents, do you want to introduce yourself? Steve, do you want to go first?
Hiya, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I'm Steve Barnshaw. I'm Director of Compliance for Stroma Building Control.
And I'm Rob Waiting from Stroma Built Environment. We do the SAP assessments as part of our work here.
I think you're underselling yourself. You're a principal consultant for us at Stroma Built Environment, Rob. Yeah. So today we're talking about future home standards again. We did have an episode previously more generally on this, but as we've travelled this road, the whole discussion around PV requirements and potential, I'm stressing that word, exemptions under the future home standards have been asked about and talked about and discussed, not least with our building control colleagues who have views as well. So just to sort of take that back to first principles, the UK Future Home Standards, which was published, as we may or may not know, back in March this year, mandates rooftop solar PV, which is equivalent to 40% of the home's ground floor area. This, on one level, seems very clear, but then out of that, thinking about it for a bit, there's other things and questions that have been brought up quite sensibly, really. What happens if you can't get the right amount of PV on, etc., for various reasons. So we're going to discuss some of these today. I don't think we've got full answers for a lot of them, but I think this is definitely a work in progress. So I think we'll kick off and we'll start. So, as I've said, Part L3 of the building regulations, as a default, says we've got to do this 40% of the dwelling ground floor area, including cold areas. And just before we go down this road, the building regulations are more widespreading in terms of the amount, what they mean about renewables generally. They do want, at a higher level, talk about renewable generation sources, but in reality, you're really only talking about wind or PV that will directly generate electricity. So PV immediately becomes the favourite out of both of those, and then the building regulations and the approved document do then start going down the road of talking about PV in a lot of detail. So just clear that up before we start. Let's just talk technicals, I suppose. So how are developers supposed to hit this target? Rob, do you want to take that one?
So this is, we already know that to meet the other emissions part of Part L, you're only going to deliver it with a heat pump. Strictly speaking, you could use other forms of heating, but the amount that, because the notional building uses a heat pump, you pretty much force down the heat pump route. What we're talking about here is what is generated on site in addition to what your heat source is. So the way they've calculated this, they want PV to be included to every dwelling on the site. It's not like a site-wide calculation. And that's 40% of the dwelling's ground floor area. You take that figure and then you multiply that by 0.22 kilowatt peak per square metre. And then there's an angle and an orientation that it assumes as well. And that will generate you a target of electricity that needs to be generated on site. And really, the only way you're going to achieve that is through solar PV. There is exceptional circumstances listed in the Part L document for where this isn't going to be the norm, because I think during most scenarios, if you've got a straightforward designed house with not a straightforward shaped roof, then you won't have any issues. Like the way it's being calculated, this 40% of the ground floor area means in most situations you can deliver that. You just need standard efficiency panels these days, and you will fit enough panels on the roof for it to generate that. But I think they've recognised that there may be some circumstances where you may not be able to generate this on site, and they give you quite narrow reasons for what is a reason that you can't generate it on site, basically. And that you've, as the developer and the person responsible for demonstrating to someone like Steve in building control what you've done to deliver this, there aren't many reasons you can give that you haven't delivered it. Is that right,
Steve? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Can I wind back slightly?
Of course.
I just wanted to emphasise something that Rob said there when he talked about it being on the building. So if we just, because we haven't specifically talked about this new requirement, so the new requirement L3, so this is brand new to the building regulations. It's in Schedule 1 to the regulations, so it doesn't have any wriggle room in it. And Stuart, you said at the beginning, it's mandated. Yes, it's L3 is mandated. So as you said, there needs to be renewable electricity generation on the building. It does give some exceptions off the building within the curtilage of the site. So, but what I wanted to emphasize is that we have a brand new requirement, which is mandating something in terms of electricity generation from a renewable source. And of course, when you do that, you need, as you've said, to give some options perhaps where it might not be possible. So like many of the Schedule 1 requirements, those requirements that start with a letter A, B, C, D, L, etc., sometimes those contains a limitation on application. And L3 has that limitation. They don't all have it, but L3 does have it. So it gives you some exceptions where you might not need to provide this, or you might be able to provide a lesser amount than is in the guidance. So but my looking at these at the moment is that these are very narrow. We have quite narrow options in terms of you moving away from this requirement.
So I think in the appendix of Part L, it states if you, in an exceptional circumstance where you can't deliver it, this is what you need to demonstrate to building control, basically. You would need to provide a roof diagram which shows this is the maximum amount of PV I can demonstrate on the building, I can fit on the building. And they give examples of those in the document of even if you've got dormers or roof lights, they show how you can fit them around those. And then there are various calculations you can then refer back to in Part L to say, well, I can't meet the 40% requirement, but there is a minimum backstop level that you should be meeting as an absolute minimum, which is 720 kilowatt hours per year, which there's going to be very few designs, I think, that can't hit that because that's a very low amount of PV panels to generate that amount per year. They've set that as a backstop.
But there seems to be a big, to my mind, there's a big disconnect between you've got to put 40% of the ground floor area on there, but if you can't, you can't get less than 720, which I know we're not like we like here in our measurements. But the question I want to really ask is, what point, if your roof isn't suitable, what's your view, Steve, on from a building control perspective of saying, well, go back and redesign your roof or make some changes to that to allow this to be the case?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, isn't it, Stuart? I think we're in the age of duty holders now, and that substantially changes the nature of how I think building control perceive these questions. So we're moving away from the age of applicants coming to the building control provider and saying, "Oh, what will you accept?" And us perhaps giving an answer to that question from a technical perspective, actually engaging with the design rather than us now saying, what we'll accept is something that is compliant. And it is your responsibility to evidence that compliance. So if your roof can't fit the PV on, and this is described in the approved document as well, then it is your responsibility as a designer to design a roof that can, unless there are some exceptional circumstances.
So I think
you have to describe those circumstances.
Yeah. It does require the principal designer to give a statement to say why they can't make any modifications to the design. So I think the regulation is expecting that if it doesn't fit, then you should be modifying the design so it does fit.
Would you agree with that, Steve?
I would, yes. Yeah. I mean, there are going to be perhaps.
I was going to say, I'm trying to put you on the spot here, trying to guide you into you telling us something that you might consider as an exception, which is a very broad word, isn't it?
It is, and I don't think we're in that ballpark yet. I think the documents are new, and we're understanding what this requirement is saying and what the limitation is saying. What we're not inquiring about at the moment is what might these exceptions look like. I think at the moment that is a conversation that designers will need to have with their clients. What do we think the exception looks like? And we can have a conversation with building control. But in the first instance, the designer's got to think, well, can we redesign the roof? Is that possible? What are the barriers to us redesigning this roof? Is there a barrier at the planning stage? Are the planners requiring us to design the roof in a particular way? If there are no barriers to the redesign of the roof, it's just an aesthetic thing. How does that then fit with the issue of compliance? Aesthetics can't override compliance. I wouldn't have thought, is in my initial view. Yeah.
And I suppose you talked about planners there. Planners are kind of getting hold of this and looking at this even earlier than you are at building control. I suppose a lot could be driven by them, because if the first instance, say, an outline plan is put into planning and then some more detailed work is done, if the planners say, well, hang on a second, you haven't got enough PV, or these roofs don't look good enough to put the required amount of PV on, go back and think again, then that kind of makes life a little bit more simple, doesn't it? Because they will come to you as building control, and then us as SAP assessors with a design that does fulfil the maximum amount, the required amount of PV.
Yeah, and I think again that's a critical point when you look at the building control system as it is now, rather than the building control system as it existed before the 2023 changes. Now, what you have in the duty holder age is the requirement for principal designers to consider building regulations right from the starting point of them putting a pen to paper, or whatever it is, however they design these things. So they're needing to think about Part L3 from the very point, way before they even make their planning application. They're thinking about how are we going to comply with Part L3. So inevitably,
and indeed all the other regulations.
Yeah, and all the other, let's just focus on L3. That they would be thinking about that in the conversations that they're having with the planning authority. And my expectation is that the planning authority will probably be thinking about that when they're considering the planning application. I mean, of course, we've got a number of sites that already have planning permission, and the roofs are already designed, and that will be a separate conversation. But those that are looking to make planning applications now, they should be thinking about L3 now, and having that conversation through their energy statement in their planning application about how they're going to meet compliance. So by the time it gets to building regulation application time, these are not the questions that we have to deal with.
We
hope, yes.
And that just opens, I know we're specifically talking about this particular renewable stroke PV requirements today, and the specific parts of the regulation which cover that. But I know we've had conversations about general sort of design stage work, including design stage SAP, and in the real world, perhaps these things don't get presented early enough to you as building control. Is that a statement that you?
That is an absolutely true statement, and has been for a long time, and as what actually was picked up in the consultation that the government ran for this iteration of Future Home Standard, is this issue of, whilst the legislation is in place, we're supposed to have a design stage SAP before construction starts on site. But often that's not the case. More often than not, that is not the case, and we'll be presented with design stage SAPs halfway through the build phase, or 3/4 of the way through the build phase. So that needs to be pulled back, and that's been that obviously that can't persist when we have this sort of requirement.
What we can do as the SAP assessor in that situation is do the SAP calculation from the current design drawings, and that will then determine an amount of PV required on the site. It will say this development must generate this many kilowatt hours of electricity from renewable technologies on this dwelling. And then that gives the developer time then to find a PV supplier, find a specialist who can do a design which says, in order to hit that amount of electricity that needs to be generated, this is how many PV panels will be required. And then 90% of the time, we would hope, or more, it meets the requirement. If you've got these exceptional circumstances, that's when you have to start then determining, well, why can't you hit them? Why can't you change the design and move something around so you can fit more panels on, for example?
Yeah, and I think if you got to that point in a building regulation application, we'd be expecting to receive a reasonable amount of information to clearly describe why you can't meet that requirement. So, plans of your roof showing the inability to fit the PVs on the roof, whatever that, the overshading issue, if it's whatever it is, if it's some other physical issue that affects the building, it needs to be described, it needs to have been explored, the options available, whether there is potential for removal or repositioning, redesign of all those things need to be evidenced in that work. I'm not anticipating that will be, just an email. I can't get to that point. I think that needs to be a piece of work.
And it's probably worth mentioning that this new PV requirement becomes a section on the approved document that you use for demonstrating building regulations compliance. Call it the BREL report.
Yeah.
So this is a section on there that will be presumably provided to the person who buys the dwelling, the homeowners, that shows, did you comply with Part L of the building regulations? And on that, there's going to be a box that says how much PV did you generate on the site, basically, on the building. And if you're below that, it's going to show in black and white, this building is not compliant with Part L regulation L3.
Yeah.
Then where do we go?
Yeah, well, this sort of combats that scenario that has happened in the past, where back in the old zero carbon days, zero carbon homes, some sites were marketed as zero carbon, but their zero carbon credentials were created by another site or by offsetting off-site. So in actual fact, that didn't necessarily benefit the individual owner of the building.
Which is a clear and upfront strategic requirement of what the future home standards are asking for, isn't it? To reduce energy bills for the individual occupant of that particular property. That clearly is a very straightforward way of doing that, isn't it? There are other ways as well. Obviously, we have to look at the design in the round, the fabric has to be right, etc., etc. But this is a very kind of, particularly if you add batteries, this is a very, I think, commercially good way as well to make a house look appealing to a buyer.
And developers or anybody submitting for approval for building control is going to find it a lot easier if you just meet the regulation rather than trying to apply for an exemption. So it should really be the last resort to say, well, I've hit all of these obstacles and I can't actually generate it on site. You're going to get a lot less questions because your BREL document is going to show compliance rather than non-compliance.
Yeah, that's again another important point from a statutory perspective. We don't, in the world of building regulations, you don't call them exemptions as such. There are some exemptions, but in this case, you're looking for dispensation or relaxation of a requirement in Schedule 1. So again, using L3 as the example, it's written in the normal functional way. It is very difficult to relax something that's written in the way that it is written. So you're really looking to dispense with it, so get rid of it in some way if you can't meet it. So, and the way the legislation is written at the moment, such a dispensation can only be granted by a local authority. So it's a separate application from your normal building regulation application. You would have a small application to the local authority to say, look, this is my development. I can't meet compliance with Part L3. I would like it to be dispensed with, and you would be submitting that evidence. You're going to get yourself into that position the building control body that you're using is not satisfied with the evidence that you're submitting to them.
Which is quite black and white, I think, as we said, and not common or garden.
No.
There's one more subject which is a bit of is sort of outside the regulations because it doesn't specifically talk about it, but it's something that has come up practically. It's the inability of the local district network operator to provide enough infrastructure in a timely way at a reasonable cost for them to accept the generated generate electricity from the PV. I've had some examples of even ranging from sites they've just said, well, we're not going to proceed with this site, right up to, well, we're too far gone now. We're going to have to, and one site particularly, they had to, admittedly under the old regs, they had to change half of the houses to the dwellings to gas boilers because the local DNO just couldn't accept the generated electricity from the PV. This is very much views, I know, gentlemen, because it's not specifically put in. You could easily say, well, not my problem, not the problem of the building regulations, but would you have any comments on that?
Well, in Part L, under the appendix for looking at alternative options or modifications, none of that is mentioned. All they are expecting as an exceptional scenario is when the design of the house precludes PV fitting on. I think the building regulation has been written on the basis that a site is only viable if it's compliant with the building regulations. So if a site cannot deliver the electricity required or the electricity to be fed into the grid, then it's not a valid site. It's not a viable site.
Which has bigger implications on strategic government objectives about building more sites, isn't it? Building more dwellings.
Yeah, I think it's again really important point that the building regulations they do this thing where it very much focuses on the building. Yeah, it is rarely ever interested in the wider infrastructure.
Yeah.
Some minor variations on that, but generally not interested in that. What it thinks is that you've already dealt with that as a developer. You've already made sure that your site is a viable site because it's got the right services feeding it for the purposes. And again, goes back to what I said earlier, in that way before your planning application, you're looking at the viability of a site, not just with your planning application head on, but with your building regulations head on as well. And that's what's been missing in the past. We've had lots of examples of that, not just from an energy perspective, but from a fire safety perspective as well, where these sites will get through a planning application, will achieve planning permission, and then they're presented to the building control body, and there's a viability issue from a fire safety perspective. That has been, we've had many applications on that front. So
we've always gone full circle because in the past developers were looking, how do I get a viable gas connection to the site?
Yeah.
Because we needed to install gas boilers to meet Part L. Whereas now it's how can I get a big enough electricity supply into the site from the outset? You need to be looking at that, and has the DNO accepted that these large PV arrays are going to be included to all dwellings and feeding back into the grid? Because without that, in Part L doesn't consider the site to be viable and housing to go ahead on it.
No, and it feeds right back into valuation of the site, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I put my previous career head on as a valuer. So these things this is right at the front, right at the forefront now, to be honest.
So in summary, think about things as early as you can, which is not new advice, is it, Steve?
No, it's not.
The irony is, so many people just go, well, let's get on with it, and then next thing we know, we're up to first floor level, and then, we might have to change the roof. That's not really a viable potential situation for many. It's certainly not good practice, is it?
No, it's not. It isn't, but it is a prevalent model in the industry, isn't it? Unfortunately.
Well, time is money, and at the end of the day, if you're building houses to sell them, you want to build houses and sell them. So very understandable. But I think the point of this conversation, and I generally, we're talking about a lot of services that we offer as consultancy services across building control as well. Get in early because it's a lot easier to change a design than it is to start having to break things on site and change things and modify things. And another example of that was with the introduction of the overheating regulations, Part O, back in 2021. People had ordered windows that didn't, and designed windows that weren't good enough or didn't have the right specification to pass Part O. So changes on site had to be made at a lot more cost than they would have been if someone had said, well, I want to change the G value properly and get on with it. So look, I think that's really good. We're not out this yet. This is very early days. The transition period is still looking at, we'll be into sort of probably 2028 before we actually have to build anything that's like this. But for getting involved early is always better. Thinking about problems, asking people to do things. We've done quite a lot of work generally around doing SAP 10.3 assessments in different sorts of houses and different sorts of dwellings, finding the sort of the shortfalls of compliance in that, and fed that back via certification to government. That's for another day and another subject. And then we still haven't talked about the introduction of the home energy model HEM, which will drop at some point in the future. So there's still all that to consider. But I think this was something that was causing a lot of conversation and a lot of sort of concern. So we just thought we'd jump on and talk about it today. So if you've got any specifics, please do get in touch in the usual way. So I thank Steve today and I thank Rob for their input. And we'll say bye for now and we'll see you next time.